The fan who turned into the biggest enemy. What happens when the loudest voice defending your team suddenly becomes the one tearing it apart? For years, Stephen A. Smith proudly wore the title of New York Knicks superfan. Through losing seasons, front office disasters, lottery heartbreaks, and decades of disappointment, he never stopped talking about the team he claimed to love. But this season, something changed. The criticism wasn't just criticism anymore, it became war. As the Knicks prepared for what many believed could be their deepest playoff run in a generation, Stephen A's words grew sharper. Every missed rotation, every bad shooting night, every questionable decision became ammunition. The man who once represented the pain of Knicks fans now sounded like their harshest enemy. And eventually, the players had enough. It started with Josh Hart. Known as the emotional heartbeat of the locker room, Hart wasn't interested in hearing another television personality question the effort of teammates who battled every night, especially when that personality was someone who constantly reminded the world that he was the ultimate Knicks fan. When Hart defended Mikal Bridges against growing criticism, Stephen A. fired back publicly. He told Hart to sit down, to be quiet, to focus on basketball. Most players would have ignored it. Josh Hart didn't. Instead, he delivered the line that sent shockwaves across the NBA world. Stephen A. Smith, according to Hart, needed to shut the hell up. In that single moment, this stopped being another media debate. It became Knicks players versus the face of ESPN. Was Stephen A. exposing uncomfortable truths nobody wanted to hear? Or had the man who loved the Knicks the most become addicted to tearing them down? Nobody knew it then, but this feud would eventually reshape the entire season, because behind the arguments, the viral clips, and the endless television debates stood a much bigger question. Had New York made a franchise-altering mistake that could destroy their championship dreams? Or were these players about to prove every doubter wrong? Before we go any further, Knicks fans, we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city and state in the comments below. And here's today's challenge. If you think Stephen A. Smith was right to criticize the Knicks, comment 1. If you think Josh Hart was right to defend his teammates, comment 2. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because this story only gets crazier from here. The trade that split New York. The real explosion was never only about Josh Hart. It was about Mikal Bridges. When the Knicks gave up a massive package to bring Bridges across the bridge from Brooklyn, the message was clear. New York was no longer waiting for the future. They were pushing their chips into the middle of the table right now. But big moves create big pressure. And Bridges did not arrive as just another role player. He arrived with the weight of draft picks, expectations, headlines, and a fan base desperate to believe this was finally the roster that could end decades of pain. That is why Stephen A. Smith could not let it go. To him, the Knicks had paid superstar prices for a player who was not producing superstar numbers. Every quiet night from Bridges became proof. Every game where he disappeared became another warning sign. Every slow offensive stretch made the trade look heavier. But inside the locker room, the story sounded different. Josh Hart saw a teammate doing what the coaching staff asked. Maybe Bridges was not getting endless plays called for him. Maybe his job was defense, spacing, cutting, switching, sacrificing shots, and fitting into a system built around Jalen Brunson. That was the core disagreement. Stephen A. judged Bridges by the price. Hart judged him by the role, and both arguments had power. Because in New York, nobody cares how complicated the situation is when championship dreams are involved. If the team wins, the trade becomes genius. If the team loses, it becomes one of the most painful mistakes in franchise history. That pressure followed Bridges every time he touched the ball. A missed jumper was not just a missed jumper. It was 5 first-round picks echoing through Madison Square Garden. A quiet fourth quarter was not just a quiet fourth quarter. It was every Knicks fan wondering whether the front office had gone too far. And that is what made Stephen A. dangerous. He was not just yelling for television. He was saying what a lot of nervous fans were secretly thinking. But Josh Hart was saying what every loyal teammate believes. You do not destroy your own guy while the war is still being fought. So the battle lines were drawn. On one side, the loudest analyst in sports demanding results. On the other, a locker room trying to protect its own. And standing between them was Mikal Bridges, the man whose performance could either silence the critics or prove them right. Josh Hart fires back. Josh Hart was never the type of player who needed the spotlight. He was not the franchise superstar. He was not the face on every billboard. He was not the player expected to score 30 every night and carry New York on his shoulders. But inside that Knicks locker room, Hart mattered. He was energy. He was effort. He was the player diving for loose balls, crashing the glass, defending bigger wings, and bringing the kind of toughness New York fans claim they want. So when Stephen A. Smith told him to be quiet, Hart took it personally. Not because his ego was hurt, because the message sounded bigger than one sentence. To Hart, it felt like a famous fan was talking down to players who were actually inside the battle, players who knew the game plan, players who knew what Bridges was being asked to do, players who understood that basketball was not always about box score numbers. And that is why Hart's response landed so hard. He did not just defend Bridges, he attacked Stephen A's identity. By calling him a part-time Knicks fan, Hart hit the one place Stephen A. Smith never expected to be questioned: his loyalty to New York. Because Stephen A. could handle people saying he was loud. He could handle people saying he was dramatic. He could handle people saying he was harsh. But questioning whether he truly knew the team, that was different. Hart's message was simple. If you are not in the locker room, if you are not wearing the jersey, if you are not fighting with us every night, then maybe you do not understand what is really happening. Suddenly, the story was no longer about Bridges' numbers. It was about respect. Respect between media and players. Respect between fans and the team they claim to love. Respect for the difference between criticism and tearing someone down before the season is finished. And once Hart said it publicly, there was no going back. The clip spread everywhere. Fans picked sides. Some said Hart was brave for defending his teammate. Others said he should focus on winning games before challenging the loudest voice in sports media. But one thing was clear. Josh Hart had turned a basketball debate into a personal battle. And Stephen A. Smith was not going to let that slide. Stephen A. strikes back. Stephen A. Smith heard every word. And if Josh Hart thought the biggest voice at ESPN was going to stay quiet after being called a part-time Knicks fan, he was wrong. Stephen A. did what Stephen A. does. He went to the microphone. He reminded everyone that his connection to the Knicks did not begin when the team became good. It did not begin when Brunson arrived. It did not begin when Madison Square Garden started believing again. He had lived through the pain, the losing years, the bad decisions, the empty promises, the long nights when New York basketball felt more like punishment than pride. So when Hart questioned his loyalty, Stephen A. took it as an insult not just to his job, but to his history. Then came the warning. Stephen A. made it clear that he did not need to be friends with players to talk about them. He did not need permission from the locker room. His job was to analyze, criticize, and say what he believed fans were thinking but afraid to admit. That response changed everything, because now this was no longer player versus analyst. It was access versus authority. Hart believed the locker room knew the truth. Stephen A. believed his platform gave him the right to challenge anyone, even the players wearing the jersey he loved. And the fans were trapped in the middle. Some loved Stephen A.'s fire. They believed New York needed pressure. They believed nobody should be protected after the Knicks spent so much to build this roster. Others were tired of the drama. They felt Stephen A. was turning a hopeful season into daily chaos, using the Knicks' pain as television fuel. But the loudest part of his response was not even about Hart. It was about the message behind it. Stephen A. was telling every Knicks player, if you want the noise to stop, win. No excuse. No explanations, no hiding behind roles, contracts, chemistry, or patience. Win enough, and the criticism died. Lose, and Madison Square Garden becomes a courtroom. That was the pressure now hanging over New York. Not just playoff pressure, not just championship pressure, public judgment pressure, and with every Stephen A. rant, that pressure grew heavier. The Knicks could ignore the noise for only so long. Soon, the games would decide who was right. Jalen Brunson enters the storm. Then the drama found its biggest name, Jalen Brunson, the captain, the closer, the heartbeat of the Knicks. The player New York had built everything around was suddenly dragged into a fight that started with Stephen A. Smith, Josh Hart, and Mikal Bridges. Stephen A.'s argument was brutal. He believed Brunson's sacrifice helped make the Bridges move possible. In his eyes, Brunson taking less money created the space, the flexibility, and the emotional push for the Knicks to chase his former Villanova teammate. To Stephen A., that meant Brunson could not be separated from the consequences. If Bridges failed, the blame would not stop with the front office. It would land on Brunson too. That was a dangerous line to cross, because Brunson was not just another player in New York, he was the reason Knicks fans believed again. He had turned Madison Square Garden from a place of frustration into a place of fear for opponents. But Stephen A. still questioned the structure around him. Could Brunson really lead this version of the Knicks to a title? Could Bridges justify the cost? Could this roster survive when the playoffs turned violent, slow, and unforgiving? Those questions made the locker room even more defensive. Because from the players' side, Brunson had already proven enough to earn trust. He had sacrificed, he had led, he had carried pressure that would break most stars. And now, instead of being protected, he was being blamed for a trade he did not officially make. That is when the story became bigger than one argument. It became a test of leadership. Brunson did not need to scream back. He did not need a viral quote. He had a better weapon: winning. Because if the Knicks collapsed, Stephen A. would look right. But if Brunson carried them deep into the playoffs, Every old doubt would come back to haunt the people who questioned him. New York had reached the point where words no longer mattered. The only answer left was on the court. And Brunson was about to be asked the most important question of his career. Can you turn criticism into a championship run? When the pressure turned dark, then the Knicks started losing. And for Stephen A. Smith, that was all the evidence he needed. Every defeat became louder than the last. Every bad possession felt like proof that New York was not ready. Every quiet night from Mikal Bridges reopened the same painful question. Did the Knicks pay too much for a player who could not carry that price? After 3 straight losses, Stephen A. went right back at Josh Hart. The message was sharp. You told me to be quiet, but your team has not won since. That was the kind of line built for television, but it also cut deep because New York fans were already nervous. The winning streaks looked weaker under inspection. The defense did not feel as nasty. The identity that once made the Knicks dangerous suddenly looked uncertain. Stephen A. attacked the whole operation. The toughness, the coaching, the roster construction, the belief that this team was truly built for June, and now the drama was no longer funny. It was heavy, because when a team loses in New York, the noise does not stay outside the building. It follows every player into interviews, into practice, into every late game possession. Josh Hart had challenged the critic. Now the critic had the scoreboard on his side. For the Knicks, there was only one way out. They had to win before the story swallowed them whole. The playoff moment that almost broke New York. Then the playoffs arrived, and the noise finally became impossible to escape. For months, everyone had argued about the same question. Did the Knicks build a real championship roster, or did they mortgage too much of their future for a team that still was not good enough? Stephen A. Smith had already made his answer clear. Josh Hart had already fired back. Mikal Bridges had already become the symbol of the entire debate. But now the cameras were brighter, the possessions were slower, and every mistake felt like it could change the future of the franchise. The Knicks did not open the postseason like a team ready to silence everybody. They looked tight. They looked unsure. They looked like a team carrying the weight of every headline, every debate, every viral clip, and every angry fan who wanted answers. Then came the kind of game that makes a city lose sleep. A one-possession loss. The type of loss where every missed free throw matters, every bad switch matters, every open shot that rims out becomes a memory fans replay all night. And in the middle of it all, Bridges delivered the worst possible headline. 0 points. Not a quiet 10, not an inefficient 12. Zero. For a player attached to a massive trade package, that number was gasoline on the fire. Stephen A. did not need to invent anything anymore. The box score was standing beside him. Every critic who questioned the deal now had the same argument. This is why you do not pay premium prices for role player production. But inside the Knicks locker room, the story was not that simple. Bridges was still defending, still spacing, still trying to fit, still searching for rhythm, in an offense that did not always run through him. The problem was that New York did not have time for patience. Not in the playoffs. Not after giving up so much. Not with Brunson fighting to drag the team forward. Not with Hart already putting his own name on the line to defend him. That was the cruelest part. Josh Hart had stepped in front of the media storm for his teammate, and now the storm was bigger than ever. Every missed Bridges shot made Hart's defense look weaker. Every Stephen A. rant sounded louder. Every fan debate became more personal. The Knicks were close to the edge. If they lost the series, the consequences would be brutal. Coaching questions, roster questions, trade questions, leadership questions, and above all, one painful question New York fans feared most. Did this team fool us again? For a franchise that had waited decades to matter this much, that thought was terrifying. The Knicks were no longer just playing basketball. They were fighting the possibility that the entire season had been built on false hope. And right when the city started to doubt everything, the pressure reached its breaking point. Either New York would collapse under the weight of its own expectations, or someone would have to change the story before it was too late. The turnaround nobody saw coming. And then, just when New York looked ready to crack, the Knicks changed the entire story. Mikal Bridges did not answer with a speech. He answered with basketball. The same player critics called too expensive started making winning plays that did not always fit neatly into a highlight reel. He defended harder. He moved sharper. He stopped forcing the game and started controlling it in quiet, intelligent ways. Suddenly, he was everywhere, cutting into open space, switching onto dangerous scorers, hitting timely shots, keeping possessions alive, doing all the small things that turn playoff teams into finals teams. And beside him, Jalen Brunson became the storm New York had been waiting for. Every time the game slowed down, Brunson stayed calm. Every time the crowd got nervous, he created an answer. He was not playing like a man crushed by pressure. He was playing like a man built from it. That changed everything. The Knicks stopped looking scared. They started looking dangerous. Josh Hart kept bringing the energy. Karl Anthony Towns gave them size and scoring. OG Anunoby locked in defensively. The roster Stephen A. had questioned suddenly looked connected, tough, and alive. Then the wins started stacking up. One win became momentum. Momentum became belief. Belief became fear for every opponent standing across from him. And the craziest part, the louder Stephen A. had been, the better the turnaround. Every old rant became fuel. Every harsh quote became motivation. Every doubt turned into another reason for the Knicks to push harder. Bridges, the player at the center of the storm, had become exactly what New York needed. Not a superstar trying to steal Brunson's team, not a savior chasing numbers, but the perfect connector on a roster that finally understood itself. That was the twist. Maybe Hart had been right all along. Maybe Bridges was never supposed to be judged only by points per game. Maybe his value was hidden in the pressure possessions, the defensive stops, the calm decisions, and the willingness to do whatever winning required. And as the Knicks kept rolling, one thing became impossible to ignore. The same team Stephen A. said was not good enough was now forcing the entire NBA to pay attention. New York had survived the storm. Now they were becoming one. Stephen A. changes his tune. Then it finally happened. The impossible became reality. The New York Knicks were heading to the NBA Finals. For the first time in decades, Madison Square Garden wasn't talking about what could have been. It wasn't discussing draft lottery odds, coaching changes, or another disappointing offseason. The city that had carried generations of basketball heartbreak finally had something it hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. And nobody embodied that emotional whiplash more than Stephen A. Smith. The same Stephen A. who questioned whether this roster had enough. The same Stephen A. who criticized Mikal Bridges at every turn. The same Stephen A. who challenged Josh Hart and put enormous pressure on Jalen Brunson now stood celebrating with tears in his eyes. He screamed. He laughed. He embraced the moment like a lifelong fan who had just watched decades of frustration wash away in real time. And that's when the internet exploded. Fans immediately dug up the old clips. The clip where he said Brunson wasn't the answer. The clip where he blasted the Bridges trade. The clip where he challenged Hart to prove him wrong. The clip where he practically buried the Knicks after difficult losses. Suddenly, social media became a courtroom. Some fans accused Stephen A. of switching sides. Others called him a fraud. Where was this energy when you were tearing them apart? You don't get to celebrate now. You gave up on them. But another group of fans defended him, because maybe that's exactly what being a Knicks fan looks like. Years of disappointment create scar. Generations of heartbreak create fear. You prepare yourself for disaster because you've seen it happen too many times before. Stephen A. wasn't celebrating because he had been right. He was celebrating because, for once, he had been wrong, and there may be nothing more human than that. Meanwhile, Josh Hart never needed a victory speech. He didn't go on television demanding apologies. He didn't revisit old arguments. He simply kept playing. The same player who defended Bridges when everyone else doubted him let the results speak for themselves. And then there was Jalen Brunson. The player Stephen A. once questioned had evolved into the unquestioned leader of New York basketball. Every clutch shot, every calm decision, every big moment, Brunson delivered. The man who supposedly wasn't enough had carried the Knicks to the doorstep of history. Even Mikal Bridges had transformed the narrative. The player labeled as overpaid became invaluable. The trade that once represented recklessness now looked like courage. The criticism that once sounded reasonable suddenly felt outdated. That's what made this entire saga unforgettable. Nobody got everything right. Nobody got everything wrong. Stephen A. challenged the team. Hart defended it. Brunson led it. Bridges justified belief. And the Knicks used every ounce of doubt as fuel. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't a press conference. It's winning. And now, with the NBA Finals in front of them, New York had a chance to complete one of the most dramatic transformations the league had seen in years. The only question left was this: could they finish the story? The lesson New York taught every doubter? In the end, this was never just about Stephen A. Smith. It was about pressure. It was about how a team reacts when the entire basketball world questions its identity, its decisions, and its heart. Stephen A. believed criticism was necessary. Josh Hart believed loyalty mattered more when a teammate was struggling. Mikal Bridges proved that value is not always measured by points alone, and Jalen Brunson showed that true leadership does not need to be loud to be powerful. The Knicks did not win the argument with words. They won it with resilience. They absorbed the noise, protected each other, and kept moving forward when many people expected them to break. That is the real lesson. Great teams are not built only through talent. They are built through trust, sacrifice, patience, and the ability to stay united when outside voices get loud. Stephen A. may have pushed them, Hart may have defended them, but the players had to save themselves. And whether New York finishes this journey with a championship or not, one thing is already clear. This Knicks team reminded the NBA that belief can survive pressure, criticism, and doubt. And sometimes, the people who question you the loudest become the same people cheering the hardest when you prove them wrong. Now we want to hear from you. If you believe Stephen A. helped motivate the Knicks, comment 1. If you believe Josh Hart and the locker room deserve all the credit, comment 2. If you think Jalen Brunson is already a New York legend, comment 3. Like this video, share it with another NBA fan, and subscribe for more deep NBA stories, drama, and analysis.